Hello everyone, Mini Ninjas here. Welcome to this particular episode of Bootleg Breakdown, which, man, it's been a long while since I've had the chance to say that. Suffice to say though, we are going to be continuing with the Super Saiyan 4 set of figures here, or bootlegs, branded horribly with the Legend Creation markers you can see there. This follow-up episode is actually going to be focusing on the Vegeta specifically here, as we've already covered the Goku a little bit earlier in the week. And as you can see, the box is a little worse for wear, and has that terrible brand upon it. Now, for those that might not be as familiar, as we just kind of take a look at the clamshell, which by the way confirms it does have all the parts, and this time correct parts, unlike the Goku. Legend Creation is not exactly known for their quality assurance in terms of the bootlegs, and unfortunately, this is no exception. Now, it's worth noting as we do the articulation test here, I had previously mentioned that I strongly believe the Goku was also made by the same group, and that's because there are actually a number of shared components between the two figures. Mind you, while they actually inserted the butterfly joints incorrectly this time around, they still don't move particularly well because the arms are actually entirely seized at the shoulder front. I can't actually bend them at all. It's also worth noting that if you're wondering why it looks like the upper torso of Vegeta is so oversized, it's because it's actually Goku's. Also, those elbows, they're the same type as Goku. Go figure. The way that the lower torso was handled is the same way. I wouldn't be surprised if most of the arms were actually Goku's except for the wrists and such. Now, the legs, mind you, they are unique. They do mostly match up with what you would kind of expect from the Super Saiyan 4 Vegeta figure, only they're not particularly well handled. As you can see, the hips pop out incredibly easy, and are a combination of both loose and too stuck. It's also worth noting, I'll bring it into camera in a few moment, is that the hip joint that's supposed to be plugging in doesn't plug in particularly well because the actual leg joints are damaged. They're actually really beat up looking right out of the box because they weren't particularly casted too well, because the hips themselves are a size too small for the ability to really fit them in properly. Now, in terms of the knees, technically functional, but you can tell it's the wrong joint. Unfortunately, I don't have the official one at the time of this recording to prove it, but just trust me, it's the wrong one. And the ankles are also busted. And the wrists are also the wrong joint. Now, before we get into the accessory check and breakdown section, it's worth noting just how much trouble this particular figure gave me. As you can kind of guess here from the incredibly beat up looking thing that's on my work table there that had to be cut into, that's because, as it turns out, I learned from the community tab, as well as checking someone else's review on the matter, that the figure, for some reason, has glue in its shoulders. Now, the amount of glue seems to vary, because the other person was able to free up the shoulder after a little bit of work. In my case, that thing was so inundated with glue, nothing was going to break it free. Normally, you could try something to get rid of super glue or hot glue, something like either warm water, boiling water, or more extreme heat. Freezing occasionally works. Vinegar bath, little dilute of course, can actually break superglue. We were going to get nothing like that. The plastic is actually ruined around that joint. It's fused, it's not going anywhere. Even after I had to cut it in there just to get this footage, I figured maybe I could kind of poke it apart, using like X-Acto knives or a sculpting pick, which only resulted in me stabbing my own thumb with the sculpting pick in question. And even then, when I finally did manage to break it free, the whole thing broke with it. As you can see there, the joint's completely busted, it's stuck partway through. Technically, the shoulder joint should have been functional. The actual shoulder bit, while it's being absolutely the wrong joint, just so we're entirely clear, technically was functional enough. And the elbow would have been functional on its own, but the way they fused it together renders the whole thing moot. And basically, I'd have to do a repair job in order to try to make something out of this. For something that is a bootleg that is roughly the same cost as the original figure, and with these many issues, and with these many wrong joints and wrong parts, it's not worth the trouble. None of this thing was worth the trouble. What can I even say at this point?
That's no good.
Alright, let's try to be objective a little bit, and we're going to cover a bit of the combination breakdown and accessory check here. First off, looking at the upper body here, as you can kind of see, yeah, technically has butterfly joints, which is something that Legendary Editions didn't used to do, but those are absolutely the wrong screws holding that in place. They're literal generic screws. They probably got it from a hardware store that are doing the job there. And the upper torso, because it's the wrong one, literally prevents the hair bits from working properly. I might have mentioned that earlier, but I want to reiterate, these things don't work properly because they're using all the wrong parts. Like, even trying to get the faces to stick on this thing are a pain because the whole thing is an odd fit. Not that the faces look particularly good, they're of varying quality because the decals themselves are varying line weights, not equally done, which is why we get this. I'm going to loosely call that supposed to be the Vegeta smirk, but wow, that looks pretty bad. The paint quality itself is terrible all around as we take a look at Vegeta with lipstick here, because they didn't do a very good job painting that in, painting between the lines. In fact, it kind of mixed the colors up. Yeah, it's not much to look at. Going down the body a bit, the abdomen is one solid plastic chunk, which, let's be honest, for most bootlegs, that's pretty standard par for the course. The hips are too small, which is why the legs keep popping out on us so very frequently on this particular bootleg. And even the actual joints that are supposed to be held in there are slightly undersized, and which is why they pop out, and pretty busted looking. It's terrible plastic quality. The knees, technically functional, but slightly off. The ankles are wrong. The wrist joints, wrong color, sticking out like a sore thumb. Technically the joints work, but you can obviously tell it's there. It's not particularly well done. The hands themselves are accurate for the toy. They have the correct amount there and the right hands. It's just that they're incredibly poorly casted, which is why there's so much flashing on them, why the detailing is so very lossy, which, considering they're supposed to be glove hands, shouldn't be the case, but hey, they managed to pull it off somehow. What I will say is, technically they did include the correct effect piece, unlike the Goku one. It's just that the effect piece looks horrid, because the casting quality is so very poor. It's incredibly foggy looking. We're not going to talk about the shoulder joints anymore. No. The only thing I will say is, technically, at least this time, the actual shoulder joints were installed correctly on this bootleg. I'll give them 1 point for that over the Goku, which had the joints put in backwards. Now, only if the rest of the actual shoulder work like it's supposed to, then at least I could give this a ho-hum or something like that. You know what? I have now figured out what I can say about this figure. Even keeping in mind the recent Gogeta review, which was mercifully cut short because of how much stuff was wrong, and the Goku, which also was a mess. This one, though, is the brand new, worst bootleg I have ever reviewed on this channel. Even keeping in mind stuff like the Kamen Rider figures, which broke right out of the box. Because at least those had the decency of breaking fast, cutting the thing mercifully short, as opposed to this one, which took literal days for me trying to troubleshoot it and all the stuff I mentioned earlier, only for it to ultimately fail anyway. And with that, I bid you all adieu. Hopefully next time around we'll have something much more pleasant to talk about. For now, take care.